wanted to explore this passage from Philippians, and in order to really talk about it, you have to talk about the whole letter, Paul's letter to the Philippians, the church in Philippi. And whenever you're interpreting the Bible, you always need to be aware of the author and his or her situation and time in history, who they were writing to. But then you also need to reinterpret it in your own time. When something becomes a part of Holy Scriptures, we're not just reveling in the life of Paul, we're also trying to figure out how we ourselves are meant to be followers of Jesus through what Paul is telling us. So, Paul wrote this from prison. We're sure of this. We're pretty sure that it was written in the years 61 to 63. He was probably writing from the prison in Rome. Could have been Ephesus, but most likely Rome. And this is definitely Paul's hand himself. And he's writing to a church that he is very fond of. He planted the church himself. It is the most westernmost church. It was the Greekest of the churches. It was in Greece. So therefore, all of the followers there were not from the Jewish tradition, but rather the Greek, the Hellenistic tradition. And he was particularly proud of that as the apostle who brought in people who were not in the original covenant with God through the Hebrew tradition. And he writes with three purposes, really. One, he's thanking them. They have sent money to support him. When you were in prison, the only way you stayed alive was by people sending money to the prison to take care of you. So he's paying for his cell. They're paying for his food, medicine, and probably papyri and ink so that he could write his famous letters. So he's thanking them because they took up a collection, and it was brought with one of his group called Epaphroditus. So he's thanking them. Then he's reminding them to follow certain models of Christ, and he names himself, Timothy, and Epaphroditus. And then thirdly, he's warning them about the enemies of the cross of Christ. Not the enemies of Christ, but the enemies of the cross of Christ. You might find it strange for Paul to say, imitate me. A lot of people are very turned off by that. I know I was very turned off by Paul when I first started studying the Bible. Seriously, what an egotist, I thought. What a narcissist. But actually, in his time, it was very important to name who your teacher was. So in both the Jewish and the Hellenistic tradition, you would say, I am a follower of Socrates, or I am a follower of Plato, or I am a follower of Rabbi Jesus. You noted what you believed in by saying who your teacher was, who your model was. And that was very important. People understood. I had a piano teacher. I went back to studying piano as an adult to get better, to improve my technique. And my teacher kept saying that he was taught by so-and-so, who was taught by this famous German pianist whose name I've now forgotten. And I was supposed to always say that I was taught by John Robinson, who was taught by so-and-so, who was taught by so-and-so. The problem is I've forgotten the other two so-and-so, so really, what good is it now? But the importance is that we are meant to have models in our own time and place. Paul was not following Jesus when he was alive. He's following the crucified Jesus who reached out to him personally in speech and a vision. But he's asking others to follow him and his followers as a close model. Follow me. And then he writes about the enemies of the cross of Christ. In his time, the enemies of the cross of Christ were people who were, as he felt, distorting the message of the cross. And this comes from all of Paul's letters. He's quite clear on this in Corinthians and Galatians, that the people who are getting it wrong are not the people who are not followers of Jesus. It's the people who claim to be following Jesus who are dismissing what he calls the theology of the cross. That cross, the one we focus on in Lent, the cross upon which Jesus died. The problem is that even then, people were ashamed by the humiliating way that Jesus died. They were embarrassed that he was treated, he was a criminal. He was arrested and executed as a criminal of the Roman Empire. And even further embarrassing was that the followers of Jesus kept getting arrested, flogged, put in prison, executed. It was already happening. And so people were saying, look at Paul, he's poor, he's in prison. That guy can't possibly be your teacher. You want a teacher who has, 2 million people listening to his podcasts. That's the real teacher about Christianity, the popular one, the rich one. That's the one that we should be following. And Paul says they're ignoring the message of the cross. He is, to a certain extent, feeling joy in his humiliation, not that he's enjoying prison, but he's experiencing a kind of spiritual joy in his humiliation because he takes it as a sign that he is more closely following Jesus, crucified Jesus, as a model. That's why he says, imitate me. Whatever privations you are suffering, and any early Christian was suffering them, being heavily taxed by the Romans, being imprisoned and so on, whatever humiliations or privations you are suffering from, rejoice in this because you are following Jesus. And he points out in the rest of Philippians how Jesus, if you remember from the famous passage in Philippians, did not hold his equality with God as something to be celebrated, but rather it was his humility and his humiliation at the hands of other human beings that established his Christian leadership, his Christian kingship. So, the enemies of the cross of Christ are the people who are dismissing the cross part. They are the people who were saying, actually, Jesus wasn't a human being. He was this purely spiritual being, and what you saw on the cross was some kind of avatar. This was a very popular Greek understanding of Jesus at the time. Couldn't have happened to God. That never would have happened to God, so it didn't happen to God. That was just a vision we were seeing. And he says, those are the enemies of Christ, of the cross of Christ. Our closest model to Paul's letter to the Philippians is Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, in which he, a follower of Jesus, is writing that he has been imprisoned for attempting to subvert laws that are racist, the Jim Crow laws, such as drinking from the whites-only fountain or eating at a restaurant that is for white people only. And he has been criticized by the Southern Christian Conference of Clergy, I think that's what it's called, the Southern Christian Conference. Religious leaders, Christian religious leaders, white ones from the South, who were saying that what he was doing was wrong. Ignore Martin Luther King. Look at him. He got thrown into prison. He's no Christian leader. If he was Christian, he would be humble and he would be waiting for justice to come. He's being crude, rude. And Martin Luther King Jr. writes, you are the enemies of the cross of Jesus. He says, our greatest enemy is not the people setting dogs on us in the public streets. It's you, because you are not willing to make the sacrifice that it takes to stand up for your fellow human beings and help them. Now, interestingly, when we were discussing this passage from Philippians in one of our leadership meetings where we've been doing scriptural study, one of our church members mentioned that in his evangelical upbringing, Episcopalians were considered the enemies of the cross of Christ. Because rather than thinking of ourselves as citizens of heaven, we're thinking of ourselves too much as citizens of this world and worrying about poor people and racism and creation care. In other words, by paying attention to the cares of the world, we are being unchristian. Now, I know a lot of other Christians who call evangelicals the enemies of the cross of Christ, right? I would definitely call the Ku Klux Klan literally burning a cross on people's lawns to terrorize them and to threaten their killing as the enemies of the cross of Christ. I spent a long time thinking about this. Who are the enemies of the cross of Christ now? And I realized that anytime I myself put myself in a stance of saying, well, I'm the right kind of Christian, those people over there are the wrong kind of Christian, I don't feel that I'm really living as a Christian. So instead, I turned it into a personal reflection in Lent. How am I a friend of the cross of Christ? How am I truly following the crucified Jesus? And how am I an enemy of the cross of Christ? There are a lot of people who would really prefer that we never sing any song that sounds sad in Lent, that we don't talk anything about the cross in Lent because that's uncouth. You know, Christianity these days, the popular Christianity, the right one, is the one that makes us feel peaceful and self-actualized. That's the kind of Christianity we need to be selling right now. But the thing is, our entire religion is really based upon the fact that a man who was God allowed himself to be publicly humiliated and killed so that he could then rise from the dead and say, "See, I am God in your midst. I was incarnated as one of you, and I went through this suffering for you. And you are to model yourself after me in some way." Now, how we suffer depends a great deal upon the circumstances of our lives. Everybody suffers. And there are times when we take on some kind of sacrificial love, something we do for others that will be hard for us, but that in some way helps us to more closely model the crucified Christ. That's what we're doing in Lent. We are standing at the foot of the cross saying, how is that, Jesus, my model? And so I invite you to do that prayerful reflection every day. How have I been a friend of the cross of Christ today? And have I at all, in any way, been an enemy of the cross of Christ? Amen.